Good evening and welcome. I am Melanie Ramey, the chair of the MCFR board, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to the last program in this spring season. I will tell you, you will be hearing from us in the very near future with regard to our plans for the fall and for next spring. And I think you'll be very interested in some of the programs we have lined up and in our new approach that we will be taking. But this evening is a very special opportunity for us, I think, to learn a lot about a country and its struggles that probably few of us have known much about. We're going to be discussing this evening the situation of Egypt and its struggles with the role of Islam in contemporary society. Now, then I would also call your attention to the icon at the bottom of your screen, the chat icon. If you will click that on, it will open up the chat room to your right in a white column, and there you can write your questions. And when Dr. Rock Singer has finished his presentation, we will have opportunity to ask him questions, which I am sure there will be many. So be sure and click on the chat icon and get ready to pose your questions, because we do have with us a very, very special expert in an area that we have not had opportunity to discuss before. Dr. Aaron Rock Singer is a historian of the Middle East and is on the faculty at the UW-Madison. And he has lived in that part of the world for 5 years. He is fluent in Arabic, fluent in Hebrew, and proficient in Turkish. So it enables him, I think, to have real insight into his scholarly work there and into the contacts that he has made with people in Egypt who are also quite scholarly on the subject. So we feel very fortunate that he was able to join us this evening, because he will trace for us this historical struggle that Egypt has had and bring us up to date in what is happening there now. It seems like in the last decade, there have been some significant changes, and I'm sure he will discuss them with us. And I invite you to be sure and be thinking of your questions as he's speaking, so that he can address them at the end. So without further ado, I will turn the program over to Dr. Rock Singer.
Well, Melanie, thank you so much. And I also want to thank Ron Rosner for inviting me to the Madison Committee on Foreign Relations, and also April Mehring for making this talk and its logistics possible. Now, tonight, I'd like to begin with an image. This is Tahrir Square in the center of Cairo on the 18th of February, 2011. That was the day when 2 million Egyptians gathered in order to not only say something about the revolution, but to symbolize something broader. This Friday gathering was called Jum'at al-Nasr, the Friday of Victory. And the prayer leader was none other than Yusuf al-Qaradawi, perhaps the most prominent Sunni scholar today and a longtime member of the Muslim Brotherhood. But Qaradawi is much more than just a Muslim brother, and mass prayer transcends divisions between the Brotherhood and its political opposition. Now, if you were to have polled the audience of that rally/prayer, you would have found that a significant number of them believed that the Sharia, Islamic law, should be the main source of law, just as you would find many of them who believed that women are obligated to cover their hair with a veil and that men are obligated to pray daily. Now, these men and women wouldn't be alone. Since the 1970s, such views have become the norm rather than the exception in many Middle Eastern countries. And here you can see a chart taken from the 2013 Pew survey. So what do we make of these two data points? 2 million people in Tahrir Square, the results of the Pew poll, support for application of Islamic law. The why is the $64,000 question here, but we're going to avoid it for now. This evening, we'll be tracing how this came to be the case. And we can talk about the why in Q&A if folks are interested. Now, we don't have Pew polls from the 50s, but we know enough about public practice during this period to know that it's only during the 1970s that public piety becomes the norm rather than the exception in most Middle East countries. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on Egypt. A, because it's a center for the development of religious movements and religious thinkers, and B, because it's also a major media producer. So its influence matters not just to Egyptians, but also well beyond its borders in the region more broadly. And as our story progresses, I'll be highlighting the role of Egyptians in locales very far away from Egypt. So in sum, in this lecture, I hope to provide you with answers to one main question and the tools to answer a second question. The question I will answer for you is how the relationship between religion and politics in Egypt changed over the course of the 20th century. And the second question that I'll provide you with the tools to answer is how should this inform how we understand Egypt today? Now, broadly speaking, there are four main explanations that are given to explain the close tie between religion and politics in Egypt. One is that it's just something about Islam, that Islam is exceptional, that it's a political religion, and that therefore, when you find Muslims engaged in projects fusing religion and politics, this is exactly what you would expect. This is an explanation that is an interesting one, but also a problematic one, because it A, assumes that there's nothing else going on in these countries that shapes their political trajectory, and secondly, it assumes that Muslims simply do what canonical texts ostensibly tell them to do. And we can unpack why that's a problematic approach if folks are interested in the Q&A. The second explanation is that religion is being exploited for political ends. If only Islamic movements wouldn't politicize religion, then there wouldn't be as close a tie between religion and politics. Now, again, this explanation has some appeal, because there are instances where Islamic movements, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, clearly are using religion for political ends. But it doesn't get us nearly the whole way there. And so we need to understand how exactly we go from the exploitation of religion for political ends to a broader shift in social norms. A third explanation, related to the second, is that Islamists have taken over state and society. Again, has a kernel of truth, but it has a problem, namely that the ranks of those who cover their hair or pray daily are far greater than the ranks of those who support the Muslim Brotherhood. For example, in the 2012-2013 elections in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood garnered between 20 and 30% in the vote, depending on the electoral competition. Around 80% of women in Egypt cover their hair. We've got a major gap there. A suggestion that perhaps the ranks of pious women and pious men go well beyond the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood's voters. Now, broadly speaking, all these explanations are unsatisfactory because they're too monocausal. They posit one causal factor to explain a broader social shift. They don't give us a sense of the dynamic negotiation of the relationship between religion and politics. They don't give us a sense of the relationship between religious and political elites and the society that they seek to regulate. So I'm going to be telling a story not of one of those groups, but of their interaction and the way in which it is that interaction of ideologically diverse and competing factions that has led to a close tie between religion and politics in contemporary Egypt. So, and broadly speaking, I'll be thinking of this change in terms of four main concepts. One is of competition, right? First question, who are you competing with? How do they pose a threat to you, whether ideological or even physical? Secondly, opportunities. What access do you have to grassroots politics? What access do you have to national politics? What are the pros and cons of national politics? To what extent does it lead to a risk of compromising on the perception that you practice a morally pure politics? Third point is about ideology and ideas. What are the central ideas that captivate these religious competitors and how do they change over time? We'll focus both on clearly, quote unquote, political issues such as visions of an Islamic state. We'll also talk about the ways in which these movements shape society. how normal Egyptians, individuals, through their daily practices, shape the world around them. And finally, a point about where politics happens. This isn't simply a question of politics with a capital P, which is to say parliamentary, national politics, but also about how religious movements and state institutions seek to shape the relationship between religion and politics on a daily level. So we have on the one hand, the sphere of national politics, on the other hand, this level of daily politics. They are both separate and need to be distinguished, but they're also connected because what happens locally ends up filtering up, what happens nationally ends up filtering down. So as we discuss this story, there's really four factions that we need to understand who they are. The first, perhaps the most well-known, is the Muslim Brotherhood. The fundamental mission of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was established by Hassan al-Banna in 1928, is to transform state and society along Islamic lines. They use contemporary organizational forms. They have no problem saying we're going to borrow that concept from the West because it's a useful concept. Democracy is at the very top of this list. They're not concerned about questions of theology. They're pretty ecumenical as a matter of their theological approach. They're really focused on how do we get stuff done? How do we get political power? How do we get social power? Our second group are Salafis. They are also an Islamic movement. They're often called Islamists. There are Salafis who are Islamists, most are not. Most do not seek political power. They're fundamentally concerned with two things. One, correct theology. If you build a house on something other than the correct ideas for Salafis, it will all crumble in the end. So there's no point in having a big tent because everyone has to agree on Islam's theological vision before one does anything else. The second point of concern for Salafis is that they believe in deriving all law from the Quran and from the authoritative account of the Prophet Muhammad's life, the Sunna. This makes them a little bit skeptical of state-sponsored projects of Islamic law because they are not solely based in the Quran and Sunnah. So you might have a case where the state says we're Islamists even, Muslim brothers say we're applying Islamic law, and the Salafis look and say, ooh, that's not how you do it. That's really problematic. That might even be so problematic it's not worth having. They are one might call them principled in spite of themselves sometimes. They often will sacrifice short-term political gain for principle. We also have jihadis. Now, you often think of groups such as al-Qaeda and ISIS. The main relevance of jihadis in this case, because neither al-Qaeda or ISIS have any real basis in Egypt, is that jihadis seek to overthrow the state. Like Islamists, they believe that political power is central to an Islamic project. Like Salafis, they believe that theology is central to an Islamic project, but they don't believe in working within the existing status quo. They believe in a revolutionary project. Finally, we have state institutions. You might be thinking, well, isn't the Egyptian state secular? Well, it calls itself secular, but I'll suggest to you that what it means to be a secular state is actually to continually define the correct relation between religion and politics. So the Egyptian state's institutions are deeply involved in this particular endeavor. So instead of telling you a separate story of all of these groups, of Muslim Brothers, of Salafis, of jihadis, of state institutions, I'm going to be focusing on a few discrete historical periods in the 20th going into the 21st century. And in doing so, telling you a story of how all of these groups interacted to shape the trajectory of the relationship between religion and politics in Egypt. Alrighty, so this is where we get to the beards. This is one of my favorite ways to talk about Islam and politics. You might laugh. He's talking about beards and Islam politics. What do these two things have to do with each other? Well, beards tell you something about the wearer's commitment to a particular political, or in this case, religio-political order. And I want to introduce you to three gentlemen. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, who died in 1949. Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi, the president and founder of Ansar Sunnah al-Muhammadiyah, the leading and oldest Egyptian Salafi organization. It's been around for about 95 years at this point. And finally, Mahmoud Muhammad Khattab al-Subki, the founder of the Jam'iyya Sharia, the lawful society for those who work according to the Quran and the Sunnah. These three gentlemen are three of the most important thought leaders in the history of religion and politics in Egypt. What is interesting about them is that they all emerge in the same basic period between about 1912 and 1928 to found Islamic movements. Now, Asubki comes first. He founds the Jam'iyya Sharia in 1912. Then World War I happens. Now, for thinking about World War I, it's significant for a couple of reasons. One is that we really have a major rupture, a major shift in global politics, which really shapes Egypt. It leads to political tumult. It leads to economic suffering. But there's more that's happening there, because at the tail end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire falls. And this means that there is no longer a caliphate. And so the question that all three of these gentlemen and their movements are tackling in the late 1920s for Asubki earlier is, what do we do? How do we handle this shift? And they have answers, right? So Hassan al-Banna says the thing that we need to do is to build an Islamic society. His focus on the state would come later. Whereas Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi says, no, it's about theology, it's about performing Islamic rituals correctly, it's about deriving all law from the Quran and Sunnah. Mahmoud Muhammad Khattab al-Subki triangulates between the two. He has inclinations to social change like the Brotherhood, but he also seeks to steer clear of overt political involvement. It's not clear if he actually said this, but there is a story of him saying, our political position is that we leave politics on the side. So these are the three main the leaders of the three main groups that would really come to shape the scene of Islamic movements in Egypt. Now, really important thing here, all of these men are seeking to model themselves after the Prophet Muhammad. They all have visions of what a prophetic beard looks like, and you can see it on the screen here. Now, as a point of interest, al-Fiqhi's beard is, by the standards of Salafism today, a pretty puny beard. Salafi beards would get much longer. At this point, really since the mid-90s, the minimum length of a Salafi beard is the fist length. So it has to basically go down to here. But this is a time before that way of acting like the Prophet Muhammad is really established as canonical within the Salafi movement, so we're not there yet. Okay. So we have the rise of mass Islamic movements in early 20th century Egypt. Now, these are all primarily preaching movements. They are movements that seek to guide their followers to a return to a pure Islam. But in doing so, they face a few challenges. One is a challenge of missionaries. As all three of these groups set up mosques, led prayers, and organized study sessions for their adherents, they weren't alone. It was exactly during this period, both before and after World War I, that Protestant and Catholic missionaries fanned out across Egypt, spreading their message. Now, as an aside, missionaries in Egypt tended to be much more successful at setting up schools and orphanages than they did actually converting anyone to Christianity. But at this time, if we think about it from the perspective of these Islamic movements, this is a time where the prospect of access to political power is slight, where the threat of these missionary movements feels incredibly urgent in the context of British colonial occupation. And so there's a real sense of a need to do something about this, to act. It's during this period, though, that it's not just missionaries laying claim to a religious space, it's also state institutions. And this gets us to this question of a secular state. And it's a central one for all of these movements. Between 1882 and 1922, the British exercised direct colonial rule over Egypt. And then from 23 to 52, indirect rule. They ruled through what was known as the Egyptian monarchy, which we'll get to in a second. It's in this context that these organizations have relatively limited access to the formal political sphere. The Brotherhood entertained the idea of running for parliament in the 1940s, but chose not to pursue it due to the perceived risks of compromising their integrity through participation in the political process. But it's important to realize that as much as we might think of the story of the interwar period as one of the Brotherhood and its hemming and hawing as regards to political participation, it's really during this period that state institutions are doing a lot religiously. It's during this period that that King Farouk speaks frequently about Islam, that he staffs mosques, that he seeks to standardize the time at which the call to prayer is sounded, that he reforms Islamic education in the public school system. It's just to say, you might be thinking this is a secular state. This is a state that's intimately involved in regulating the relationship between religion and politics, whatever name one wants to give it. What we call a secular state here, in other words, looks very different to what we call a secular state in the United States. The point for our understanding of the negotiation of the relationship between religion and politics, however, is that it is in the shadow of such a state that these Islamic movements come together around two central claims. One, for the centrality of Islamic identity over national identity, though it wasn't necessarily exclusive, it was about priorities. And the second was the importance of grassroots preaching and educational efforts in the face of Christian missionaries and state educational institutions alike. Now you might be thinking to yourself, what's Islamic about this? This doesn't feel like a replication of Islamic history. And you'd be right. But that's a point about these groups. They are inextricably products of their time. But by the same token, it's important to recognize that they're not just carbon copies of Christian missionaries. They don't simply take the methods of missionary groups and apply them to an ostensibly Islamic aim. They also have very particular ideas and priorities. And those are ideas that, while they are novel in the context of the 20th century, very much draw inspiration from Islamic history. So here you see the three groups, right? The Muslim Brotherhood, the Jam'iyya Sharia, and Ansar as-Sunna al-Muhammadiyya. The Brotherhood takes inspiration from a history of conflict and battle. In early Islamic history, you see these two crossing swords and the Quran, with the Quran being called the Brotherhood's constitution. Ansar as-Sunna al-Muhammadiyya and the Jam'iyya Sharia here and Ansar Sunnah here, they are both really committed to asking this question of how, in the face of all this tumult in the world, do we replicate the model of the early Islamic community? Now, lest you think that this is somehow going back to the 7th century, this is actually an attempt to reconstruct how Muslims lived in this period of Islamic history under the rule of the Prophet Muhammad, which is understood to be a golden era of Islamic history by Muslims. They're trying to reconstruct that period in the context of the 20th century. And it was during this period that Islamic movements in Egypt weren't alone. There were branches of the Muslim Brotherhood founded in Egypt in the late 20s, as I said, and then in Syria in the 1930s, in Jordan in 1945, in Kuwait in the 1950s, Saudi Arabia in that same decade, and finally in Iraq in the 1960s. State institutions weren't exceptional either. We see the rise of modernizing states using religion as a key source of political legitimacy through the educational system, everywhere from Iraq to Turkey to Syria to mandatory Palestine, and then to Israel and Palestine afterwards, and Saudi Arabia. So what are our takeaways from this period? what should we make of this period between really 1923 and 1952, where we see the rise of two of these three movements, the expansion of all of their activities. One thing we might note is that the challenge of missionaries in government institutions is really central to their visions, that they are shaped by these external and domestic forces, and that makes perfectly good sense. They're not replicating Islamic history. They are seeking to carve out a niche in a competitive religious marketplace, both Islamic Christian and also internally Islamic. In this context, the specific form that they take relates to the opportunities available to them. They don't talk much about Islamic states during this period because an Islamic state is really not a plausible option. They talk about how to Islamize from the grassroots up. So the question is, what are our continuities and what are our ruptures? We see a continued commitment to the normative model of the early Islamic community. But we also see certain ruptures. Increasingly, we see the precedence of national over religious identity. This is something that over time in all of these groups one sees, with Salafis of Ansar Sunna being the most ambivalent about being Egyptian citizens, but not seeking to leave Egypt, just being deeply ambivalent about it. We also see the marriage of religiosity and mass movements, of a project of social mobilization in which you gather tens of thousands of people together in the service of a particular cause. This was not possible in the 19th century. And the reasons it's possible are not just about these movements, they're also about increases in literacy, increases in transportation infrastructure, and so forth, and also, of course, political opportunities. Okay, now this brings us to 1952. You see this man right here is Sayyid Qutb, one of the Muslim Brotherhood's most prominent thinkers. For some, he's famous, for others, he's infamous. We'll talk about that in just a minute. First, we need to talk about the rise of the Free Officers, a group of junior Egyptian army officers led by two men, Muhammad Naguib and Jamal Abdel Nasser. They topple the British-backed King Farouk, and they bring a vision of secular nationalism to Egypt. Now, this vision of secular nationalism ultimately leads to the mass imprisonment of leaders and the rank and file members of the Brotherhood, and also to continued executions. This is very much secular authoritarianism. Now, one might think of Abdel Nasser as an exception, but he's really not. And here you see two of his contemporaries, Reza Shah in Iran and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, with Reza Shah ruling from 25 to 41 and Atatürk ruling from 1923 to 1938. But I want to come back to Sayyid Qutb. Abdel Nasser poses a problem for Qutb. He poses a problem for a very simple reason. In the Sunni political tradition, there was a very weak sub-tradition of rebellion or revolt. As long as the ruler didn't come out and basically declare himself no longer Muslim, engage in acts of flagrant disbelief, which is kufr bawah, is the yardstick. You have to come out and say, oh, I'm not obligated to pray 5 times a day. That kind of act, or there's more than one God, something like that. In the absence of that, it was very hard to justify revolt against a ruler. So Qutb had a problem, and the Brotherhood more broadly had a problem. The problem wasn't limited to that, though. The problem wasn't merely that Abdel Nasser was authoritarian. It was also that Abdel Nasser was deeply involved in seeking to transmit his own project of religion and politics. And we can begin with his 1961 reorganization of the preeminent seminary of Sunni Islam, Al-Azhar University. His goal wasn't just to assert control over this formerly independent bastion of religious authority. He also sought to modernize Azhar to better answer what he understood to be the questions of the age. Now, we can discuss what this actually means in practice, But the key thing to emphasize here is we have a secular dictator, again, thinking about what this word secular means, intervening in the curriculum of a seminary. Now, his intervention wasn't limited to Azhar either. He also directed bureaucrats to amend the primary and secondary school curriculum, particularly the religious educational curriculum, to suit his ideological goals. So when he was trumpeting ideas of scientific socialism, his supporters were finding ways to make an argument that Islam not only supported, but was the source for scientific socialism. And through these textbook revisions, some really wacky things sprouted roots in early Islamic history. All right, so this brings us to the question of Islamic movements under Abdel Nasser. Now, the Brotherhood faced incredible repression during this period, but as important as that is that they start talking about what a state looks like. They start to really think about the importance of an Islamic state. They start to make an Islamic state more central to their project. Now, the explanation of a closer relationship between religion and politics that pivots on the Islam explanation can't explain this, because it doesn't explain why the Brotherhood comes to talking about an Islamic state after it's been around for a quarter century. The better explanation is that they saw exactly how powerful an authoritarian secular nationalist state was. They saw its control over state institutions, particularly educational institutions, and they said, we want some of that too. That's a really attractive thing. That's a really powerful vision. Now, during this period, as the Brotherhood suffers from repression under Abdel Nasser, Salafis essentially try to sidestep these battles. They continue their efforts to spread basically, one might say apolitical, but at the very least quietest understandings of Islamic theology and law throughout Egyptian society. They're not trying to rock the boat. They just want to be left alone to pray and to transmit their understandings of Islamic theology and law. They really stay within the mosque during this period. It's a period of circumscribed activism even for Salafis, despite the fact that they're not actually formally repressed. Now, by steering clear of nationalist politics, they actually are able to do more than one might think. There's a value of appearing apolitical, because in the process, they're actually debating some of the issues on which a nationalist project of mass mobilization pivoted. What does it mean to be a faithful citizen? Should people be first and foremost Muslims, or should they be first and foremost Egyptians? What's the relationship between those two sets of allegiances? And then we have Said Qutb's alternative. It's the alternative that is perhaps best known today. It is the alternative that has very much been an inspiration for jihadi groups worldwide. So we have Said Qutb. He's formerly a leftist literary critic. He sought to solve a problem, this problem of how do you overthrow a Muslim ruler, by arguing that Abdel Nasser was not Muslim at all. Not only was Abdel Nasser not Muslim, but he ruled by man-made laws, as Qutb put it, instead of divine laws. And because he did so, he was challenging God's authority over man. Similarly, he used national borders, while for Qutb, the only way to understand Islam's core beliefs was to say that there are no national borders. There is simply a transnational Islamic community, an ummah. So Qutb goes to Abdel Nasser's gallows in 1966, but his radical ideas live on. With the rise of jihadi groups in 1970s Egypt that practiced something known as takfir, declaring other Muslims to be infidels or kafirs. This is one of the main tools that jihadi groups use today to declare it permissible to attack other Muslims. The idea here, and this is the real innovation, is to say you don't need to engage in flagrant disbelief anymore. You need to do something that is not according to what we understand to be Islamic law or Islamic theology. So if you've paid taxes to a secular state, you are swearing allegiance to that state, you are defying God's oneness and his rule over his authority over mankind, and therefore you're no longer a Muslim. It's really, takfir is such an incredibly dangerous tool because it is so easy to do. And then we have the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, which really brings an end to Abdel Nasser's project. Now, this war ostensibly pit Israel against a coalition of Arab countries, including Egypt. But it also pit Egyptians against themselves. There's a question of what kind of country should we be in the future? What role should Islam play in our political system? And in this context, we have three main legacies of this period that then go into the 1970s, where one has something called an Islamic revival. The first is that Islamists are now really interested in state power. The second is that jihadism is an option, though it's still a very marginal one in Egyptian politics. And finally, this reminder of the religious politics of being a secular dictator. You might not have expected to hear those words together, but they go together and for a reason. This brings us to Muhammad Anwar as-Sadat, who called himself the believing president, al-Rais al-Mu'min. This is a period in which the Egyptian state very much pushes a religious message, in which they not only teach Islam in public schools, they not only use al-Azhar towards particular ideological ends, but they actually allow Islamic movements to mobilize too. And it's in this context that the Brotherhood returns to the fore, as well as Salafis and other Islamic movements as well. Now, you might think of Sadat and say, well, was he a secular or a religious ruler? He called himself the believing president. He prayed 5 times a day. He also changed the Egyptian constitution, first to state that Sharia would be a source of Egyptian law, and eventually by 1981, the main source of Egyptian law. This is also a period in which state institutions such as Azhar and the Ministry of Endowments, which controlled a lot of the mosques, would take an active part in defining the relationship between religion and politics. But there was more going on here. It was an effort by both Islamic movements and state institutions to shape society. And here we see the rise of an Islamic revival. And you might be thinking, what is an Islamic revival? Again, it's not about going back to Islamic history. This isn't some replication of the past. It is about people turning to religion, seeking to excavate models of religious purity from the past and bring them squarely into the present. And in the 1970s, there were 3 key shifts that we see in Egypt up to this day. One was the expansion of religious education, both within state institutions and through the foundation of new educational institutions by Islamic movements. When we think of the Muslim Brotherhood's educational apparatus, that emerges from the late 1970s on. The second thing we see is the popularization of daily prayer. It becomes the norm rather than the exception. It was not previously. And finally, we see the popularization not merely of modest dress for women, but more broadly of modest social relations, not just of men and women keeping a distance, but of taking on a set of bodily practices, of averting their gaze, of dressing in certain modest ways, in seeking out communities that will help support that kind of lifestyle. That has grown much more prevalent in Egypt over the past half century. Now, I also somewhat glibly have the 4th bullet point here being study abroad for jihadis, because jihadis fail in 1970s Egypt to topple the state. They try on several occasions. They successfully assassinate the Minister of Endowments, Muhammad al-Dhahabi, in 1977, but they can't topple the state. But then something really opportune happens for the jihadis, which is that the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979. So off with their ideological sympathizers from Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Palestine, and elsewhere, they go to Afghanistan and they partner with local Afghani leaders to fight the Soviets. And it's in this context that these jihadis who are known as the Afghan Arabs, seek to live a pan-Islamic world that pivots on the ability of a project of religiously framed violence to create a political community that places Islam first in Afghanistan. So what should we make of the Sadat period? There's a few takeaway points. One is that this is a story of the mobilization of Islamic movements. The shifts of this period are really found in allowing these movements to mobilize on a scale not seen since the 1930s and perhaps the 40s, though the 40s had a significant amount of repression too. Like in previous periods, we see state institutions playing an active role in shaping the relationship between religion and politics. And we also see the convergence of religion and politics on a state level. We see an increasingly close relationship between the dictates of the Sharia, or at least the theoretical dictates of the Sharia, and what lawmakers claim to be implementing. Whether they actually do so is a second question. But this becomes much more of a legitimate position in the Egyptian political system, basing laws on the Sharia, whereas previously under Abdel Nasser really isn't. And finally, and most importantly, we see the rise of mass religiosity. We see an increasingly close relationship between religion and local life as people seek to organize their lives around Islam in a way that places religious identity as equal, if not slightly above, national identity. So what we have here is not just an increasingly close tie between religion and politics within the state, but also within the population. And this brings us to the reign of Hosni Mubarak. In 1981, Anwar Sadat is assassinated by a member of a jihadi group, and his vice president, Hosni Mubarak, takes his place from 1981 till 2011. Now, Muslim brothers and Salafis in this period continue to organize. They continue to build their grassroots networks, but there is something new that happens, namely that the Brotherhood seizes on opportunities for electoral participation, first by allying with non-Islamist parties because they're not initially allowed to run on their own ticket, and eventually running on their own ticket, which you see is really culminating during 2012, 2013, when they win the most seats in parliament. Now, it's in this context that the Brotherhood's thinkers really give serious thought as to what an Islamic state looks like, right? In the 50s and 60s, they decide this is something worth having. In the 70s and 80s and really 90s, it becomes much more of a central question. The how becomes much more of a central question. And there's a group of Islamist thinkers who are collectively known as Islamic constitutionalists that become influential during this period. And Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture, is one of them. What does it mean to be an Islamic constitutionalist? Well, it means, as a matter of beginning, to take seriously the importance of civil liberties, a separation of powers, and the peaceful transfer of rule following elections. It also means to have a state that can transmit a model of Islam, not merely for an international audience, but also for the population, where pious Muslims can look and see themselves represented in that state, where they can find that the state structures are conducive to living an Orthodox Muslim life. Now, there are, of course, tensions in this project. What was the role of women in such a state? How should issues of blasphemy be handled? What is the role of Christians to be in such a state? What about public disregard for Islamic law? Should it be published? Should alcohol be prohibited? Even with these tensions, and they're real tensions, the message from the Islamic constitutionalists was clear. We care about democracy, not merely as a means to an end, but as the ideal form of Islamic government. If you're going to have an Islamic state, it should be an Islamic democratic state, is their position. The state, though, has to have a religious mission of shaping society, otherwise it doesn't fulfill that mission. Now, we shouldn't get too carried away on this focus with the state, because really during the Mubarak period, the Brotherhood is most fundamentally involved in continuing to build its grassroots networks, like their Salafi counterparts. And for that reason, we see during the Mubarak period that both Muslim brothers and Salafis really developed very expansive networks of mosques and local branches throughout Egypt. And that's one of the reasons why they were able to mobilize so quickly after 2011. So what are our takeaways then of the Mubarak period? One is the persistence of local preaching. It's always mattered, it still matters. If you want to talk about what Islamic movements do throughout their history of nearly 100 years, we first and foremost have to talk about grassroots preaching. We also see new opportunities for political participation, matched by new ideas of an Islamic state. With state power as a possibility, there really is this question of, well, what does it mean to be in power? Now, some of those questions get resolved. Others, as we see post-2011 with the Brotherhood's internal negotiations, are left unresolved until they are no longer possible. One can no longer ignore them. And finally, we have this point that popular religiosity persists. This is a broader shift in Egyptian society. It's about much more than just Muslim brothers and Salafis. It is about the fact that millions of Egyptians who supported Hosni Mubarak were also part of the Islamic revival. Now, this brings us to the post-2011 period. How and why does this history matter as we seek to make sense of the political tremors, the polarization, and the violence of the post-Arab Spring Middle East generally, and Egypt in particular? Now, in Egypt, we saw first the democratic election of a Muslim Brotherhood member, Mohammed Morsi, who rules for roughly a year, from 2013 to 2014. He's then toppled by a military coup, which has popular support. He's jailed after this coup, and he dies in June 2019 in Egyptian prison from a combination of pre-existing conditions and medical neglect. In his stead, we have Egypt's new president, al-Fattah al-Sisi, formerly head of Egypt's leading military body, the Supreme Council for Armed Forces. Yet, as you might expect from this history of the preceding 60 years, al-Sisi is not exactly a bulwark of secularism. Instead, what his goal is to use religion to advance his policy objectives. He seeks to paint a zero-sum game in which Egypt is divided between him and the threat of terrorism. But this claim hides the fact that a majority of Islamists in Egypt fight not to destroy Egypt, but to participate within it. He is engaged in a project of repression that is greater than any that Abdel Nasser ever engaged in. Now, this isn't to say that the Brotherhood didn't engage in mistakes and overreach in its claim to power when it was in power for that year. It often excluded other contestants to political power from access to government institutions and processes of political negotiations. It ruled in a majoritarian fashion. It did not, however, jail hundreds or even thousands of its political opponents, and it did not declare its political opponents to be beyond the law, or rather to be their activities to be illegal. Now, the crackdown on the Brotherhood has coincided with the rise in jihadi violence in Egypt that seeks to undermine the authority of the Egyptian state and to challenge the validity of national identity. This is not a coincidence. By describing the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization and treating it as such, al-Sisi has created a self-fulfilling prophecy by which segments of the Brotherhood turn to violence alongside existing jihadi groups in the absence of any alternative. Yet, like we see in other regional countries, such as Tunisia, even though we have this polarization between the Brotherhood and al-Sisi, it's important to remember that many voters see no conflict between religiosity and opposition to Islamism. Islam remains a key component of national identity, even as Islamists languish in jail. So I'm going to conclude by coming back to our original explanations of Islam, explanations of economic disappointment, of the exploitation of religion for political ends, and of the Islamist takeover of state and society. Now, let's just make a general historical point. What Islamic movements and states have done in the 20th century is considerably different than the dominant practices of pre-modern Islamic history, which is to say prior to 1800. It is radically different from anything one sees in the 7th century. The question then becomes, how do we explain them? And the answer is that we can understand them as competitors who collectively produce something that none of them would have come up with on their own. It's a story of how secularists within the state, Islamists, and Egyptians within Egyptian society push for a greater tie between religion and politics for their own, to serve their own interests, and in the process create a model of a relationship between religion and politics that really has little basis in Islamic history, that is really a product of questions of mass social reform, state power, and ideological mobilization that are recognizable to students of 20th century social movements and states. I'll leave off with a point here. None of this is inevitable, right? There is no part of Islamic history that mandates a close tie between religion and politics. One can certainly say that that history gives resources for a project of fusing religion and politics, certainly if one focuses on the early Muslim community under the leadership of Muhammad in 7th century Arabia. But what we have here is not that. What we have here is a story of ideologically diverse claimants to political and eventually religious authority who come together and produce something that is, on the one hand, is inspired by the past, but on the other hand, is deeply novel. I'm going to conclude at that, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, Dr. Roxinger, we have several questions for you. And now I have to find them again. They seem to have disappeared somewhere. Okay, the first question is the post-Ottoman period with a weak secular state important in the persistence of sectarian struggles today?
I love questions about sectarianism and sort of the post-Ottoman Middle East, right? So there's a few explanations we get for the dominance of sectarian identity, Sunni, Shi'i in the Middle East today. One is that we have the fall of the caliphate and then the rise of these states that don't really speak to the identities of their populations. A very common explanation is that the reason we have sectarianism today is because colonial powers, French and British, drew a series of borders that didn't correspond to populations. That plays into explanation number one of this weak tie between states and the societies over which they rule. I actually think about this a little bit differently. I think that sectarianism is usually the product of strong states, not weak states. And the reason for that is this. Sectarian identity is something we've had throughout all of Islamic history. It becomes significant in very specific contexts, right? So we see it becoming significant in Lebanon after independence, but also to a limited degree prior. We see it becoming significant in Iraq, post Saddam in particular. And the question is why, right? The answer is that in both Iraq and Lebanon, places where we have as bad sectarianism as there is anywhere, they haven't had weak states, they've had strong states. And I mean by strong states, I mean states that are able to really shape the world in which their citizens live. And here we have states that have actually apportioned socioeconomic bounty, basically these socioeconomic privileges based on sectarian identity. And as a result, those identities become primary because people's livelihoods, their day-to-day existence are being shaped by them. If you take that away and say sectarian identity is one part of who you are, but ultimately you're bound by a social and a socioeconomic contract with your neighbors who are of a different sectarian background to you, it becomes much less powerful. We can say the same thing about Iraq. Saddam Hussein comes to power in the late 60s and engages in a project of intentionally pitting Sunnis and Shi'is against each other. He does this, this is a goal of divide and rule. In the process, he enfranchises the Sunni Arab portion of the population and disenfranchises the Shi'i portion of the population. It's unsurprising that sectarian identity becomes powerful in Iraq post-2003 because it has become powerful over the previous several decades because this is how goods are distributed in Iraqi society. Now, to be very clear, this isn't just about socioeconomic benefits. These identities come from somewhere. They are shaped by transnational border flows, particularly the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. But the reason they are so powerful in these two countries is that the social contract has become a sectarian one due to the very purposeful divide and rule strategies employed by rulers.
Okay, the next question is, does the prominence of the military as an engine of the economy pose a dead weight burden on Egypt?
Yes. I mean, I sometimes try to explain the Egyptian military that its ostensible main purpose is to fight wars and defend borders, but that as a matter of practice, it's much more involved in selling toilet paper and air conditioners, because it is actually, its economic breadth is staggering. It's also the case that the military budget is top secret. And so there's no way to really know where money goes in the military. There's a tremendous amount of corruption in the military. So yes, it is absolutely a dead weight on the Egyptian economy. Now, it's not the only economic challenge Egypt faces. Most recently, it's been COVID, but before that, it was really the failure of the welfare state model to take care of the citizens, the failure of the educational model to create to prepare citizens for well-paying jobs. But the military is certainly part of the story.
Okay, the next question is, why is Middle Eastern Islam much more strident as a political force than we see in Southeast Asia, for example?
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, the story of Islamic movements generally, and Islamism in particular, is one that is a story of intimate linkage between the Middle East and South Asia. And here I'll give you two examples. One is that there are close ties throughout the 20th century between the leading Islamist movement in the Middle East, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the leading Islamist movement in India and then Pakistan, the Jamaat-e-Islami. Hassan al-Banna is welcomed in Pakistan. Abu Ala al-Maududi is welcomed in Egypt. I remember looking through the Muslim Brotherhood's magazine from 1979, the year that Maududi passes away. He gets the cover. I mean, he was an incredibly important figure for Egyptian Islamists. And so I think there's a real connection there. Now, and they're shaped by each other's ideas. So I'm going to give you an example. It was actually South Asian Muslim thinkers who came up with an idea that was really central to Sayyid Qutb in his work, his classic work that inspired jihadis and justified takfir. It was this idea that the society around them lived in something called Jahiliyyah, which historically refers to an age of barbarism prior to the rise of Islam in Arabia. But here, these Indian Islamic thinkers repurposed the idea to describe the societies in which Muslims live today. That came from South Asia to Egypt and then beyond. Second point I'll make is that if we look at the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Shi'is in India and Pakistan are deeply shaped by what Ayatollah Khomeini is saying. And so I'm not sure I see either as being strident. We have jihadis in both the Middle East and South Asia. In both cases, we have powerful Islamic movements that have laid persuasive claims to Islamized state and society. So I see actually it being much more of a story of similarity than of difference.
Do you think that al-Sisi is a Goldilocks leader for Egypt, one that's just right?
I'm not sure what a Goldilocks. I'm getting the image of sort of porridge and bears, and having trouble imagining Sisi surrounded by bears and porridge. But I'll take the second part of the question. Is he just right for Egypt? Look, Egypt faces a lot of challenges right now. I understand the appeal of a strongman ruler. I also think that authoritarian strongman policies are ultimately not going to change the basic problems or resolve the basic problems that Egypt faces. They're not going to resolve the fact that the social contract is broken. They're not going to resolve the fact that Egyptians are alienated from politics. They're not going to recreate a welfare state. Ultimately, there needs to be an honest accounting of what the Egyptian state can actually do for its citizens rather than what it promises to do for its citizens. But to have that honest accounting, one actually needs to have an honest public conversation. A secular authoritarian ruler can't facilitate that conversation. I mean, that's in some sense what is so tragic about the last decade in Egypt, that there's a world in which one has an Egyptian story more similar to its Tunisian counterpart. But instead, we essentially have a secular nationalist ruler who now is just pushing everything underground. Now, I would rather a contentious and sometimes dysfunctional democratic system than a highly repressive authoritarian system, even in times of trouble. Because ultimately it's just kicking the can down the road. And whoever, whether it's Sisi or whoever comes after Sisi, is going to have to deal with these challenges that he is not facing right now.
Do you think that is democracy incompatible with Islamism?
Well, from the story I've told, I think the question might be, and I'm being a little bit provocative here, but the question might be, is democracy incompatible with secular nationalism? Because what I see in Egyptian history is primarily secular nationalists who are embracing authoritarian politics and disregarding democracy. Now, I don't actually think either secular nationalism or Islamism is incompatible with democracy. I also don't think either are intrinsically compatible with it. I think it is fundamentally a question of what sub-tradition within these approaches one takes. There are certainly understandings of Islamism compatible with democracy. There are also understandings of secular nationalism compatible with democracy. But what we see from Egypt is, again, the history is more one, if we're asking of what have states done in practice, the history is much more one of secular nationalists turning to authoritarianism. So I think in that sense, it's we need to ask the same questions of both secular nationalists and Islamists. And I think that secular nationalists in Egypt bear some burden to explain why the secular nationalist project has so often ended up in authoritarianism.
What is the status of the Coptic Christians now in Egypt?
It is a difficult one. And it's a difficult one for a couple of reasons. One is because you can think about it along two axes, basically. There's an axis of elites and who is a member of the secular nationalist elite, and Copts are disproportionately represented in that group. But they are not, the people represented among these financial elites are not most Coptic Christians. And here, Coptic Christians are really caught between a rock and a hard place because they're scared, and understandably so. I understand their concerns very much of the Muslim Brothers and the Salafis. They feel like they would be second-class citizens in such a state. That's not an unreasonable question to be asking. But also, they're scared of these secular nationalist rulers who are infringing on the civil liberties of all Egyptians. Now, historically, what they've done is essentially ally themselves with the secular nationalist rulers. That's an understandable decision. It's an impossible position they're in. I would also say that secular nationalist rulers have often used them as a pretext to clamp down on Islamist groups. And so one of the ways that both Mubarak and Sisi have justified repression of Islamists is saying, oh, well, we're protecting the Copts. Whether the Copts have asked to be protected in those specific cases is an entirely different question. But I'm extremely sympathetic to what it means to be a religious minority in Egypt right now. I think that the challenges of what it means to be a religious minority, though, have to be looked at in a broader context of what does it mean to, think of economic challenges. What does it mean to be a poor person in Egypt right now, right? And we're not talking about, what looks like poor in the American context is totally different than what looks like poor in the Egyptian context. And so it's a really challenging life. It's a life where you die early, where you struggle with obesity, where you don't have access to good nutrition for your kids. It's a life where, you could understand why someone would want to emigrate. And so I think that Copts, being Coptic Christian in Egypt is a very challenging thing right now. But by the same token, it is, for people, it's their home. And so I think there's a value in that. And I think there's just a value more broadly in thinking of all the different segments of Egyptian society that really are struggling under the status quo and are, in life situations that none of us would ever want to be in.
Have you read Islamic exceptionalism? And if so, what are your thoughts about it?
I read the introduction. I read it, and I think I read the rest of I skimmed the rest of the book. It was years and years ago. Shadi is a very smart guy. I think that where he and I differ in our approaches is really that he's really focused on Islamist movements, and he's really focused on understanding essentially how these movements seek to shape political systems in their own image. I'm much more interested in drawing out the similarities between Islamic movements generally, Islamists in particular, and their ideological counterparts, their ideological competitors. Now, I think to come back to the title of the book, which very much draws on the work of the preeminent Princeton historian of Islam, Michael Cook, in a book, Ancient Religions, Modern Politics, the Islamic tradition is exceptional in the sense that if you want to engage in a project of fusing religion and politics, it provides you resources that other traditions don't have. And Cook's comparison points here are Catholicism and Buddhism. And the point here is, the metaphor is that religious traditions are not an alphabet that you can assemble however you want. They're menus, that certain things are easier to get off of them than others. So you can, I think the metaphor is that you can, it's hard to order sushi off of a Italian restaurant menu, but it's easy to order it off of a Japanese menu. Now, that's one point, right? If you want to fuse a project, you want a fusion of religion and politics, going to Islamic history, you have more inbuilt legitimacy, you have more resources. The crucial thing just to recognize here is that if the Islamic tradition is exceptional in its resources for a project of religion and politics, that does not mean, and here this is an argument that Cook makes very explicitly, that does not mean Muslims are exceptional. Muslims may choose to engage in this project or not to engage in this project. It is plausible that projects of fusing religion and politics are more attractive in Muslim majority societies because of the normative centrality of the early Islamic community under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad. But I wouldn't want to say any more about the book without going back to it and reviewing it. The the sad thing is you read too many books about Islam and politics and you forget parts of some of them. And so I'm a little bit rusty on that particular one.
Okay, the next question is the role of local preaching predatory on state creation?
Does it, in the sense, so the way I'm understanding this question is whether it gets in the way of states establishing themselves as sovereign within their own territory. I don't think so. I think it's really, I tend to take the power of modern states pretty seriously. They are extraordinary bureaucratic machines. They shape our lives in ways big and small. I tend to see Islamic preaching movements as reacting to what states do, but having relatively little institutional power without direct access to the state. And that it's really states, whether colonial or post-colonial, that restrict how strong Islamic movements can become. I can't think offhand of sort of with the rise of post-colonial states in the Middle East in the 20th century, I can't think of a state that has been held back by the previous existence of Islamic preaching associations. I don't think the Pakistani state was held back by the existence of the Jamaat-e-Islami. I mean, it was very much a competitor, a sort of a claimant to authority, but I don't think that prevented the creation of a strong state in Pakistan. In Egypt, Abdel Nasser establishes an incredibly muscular secular nationalist state, despite notwithstanding the existence of multiple Islamic movements when he comes to power. So yeah, I think it's much more that states can be predatory on the lives of Islamic movements than vice versa.
Dr. Roxinger, that's all of the questions. I'm sure you're glad because we had a lot tonight. But thank you so much for being with us and for your expertise and willingness to take all of our questions. And I would say to those viewing that this program is being recorded and will be posted on our website probably by the end of this week. And an easy way to find our website is just to Google Madison Committee on Foreign Relations and we come right up. But I'd also remind those who are watching that our season actually starts in September. And we have an excellent program at that time with with Ambassador Mark Green, who's going to be talking with us about the importance of repairing our fragmented foreign relations. In October, we'll have Professor David Romano, who will discuss the Kurds situation and the topic of the Kurds, must stateless mean friendless, which should be very interesting because we haven't heard anyone with expertise on the Kurds in quite a while. And then in November, Jay Marsh will be with us and we will talk about global aspects of trade and security. So we have a very good fall season lined up, and this program this evening is just an example of the quality of people that we are able to have come and speak with us. And so once again, Dr. Roxinger, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And we will tell everyone good night.
Thanks for having me.